A man gets swallowed whole by a giant fish and survives for 3 days inside its belly before being vomited back onto dry land. This sounds like something out of a fantasy movie, but it's one of the most famous stories in the entire Bible. The story of Jonah and the fish has been debated for centuries, with some people claiming it's impossible and others arguing it must be literally true. But the real question isn't whether it could happen, but why it happened, and what this bizarre miracle teaches us about God and human nature and second chances. Let me tell you the full story of Jonah from the beginning, because most people only know the fish part. The book of Jonah starts with God giving a clear command to his prophet. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, which was one of the most brutal and violent empires in ancient history. The Assyrians were known for their cruelty, and they were the enemies of Israel. But Jonah doesn't want to go to Nineveh. In fact, he does the exact opposite of what God commanded. He runs away. Jonah goes down to the port city of Joppa and finds a ship heading to Tarshish, which was in the completely opposite direction from Nineveh. He pays the fare and boards the ship, thinking he can escape from God's presence and avoid his mission. Here's something important to understand. Jonah isn't running away because he's scared of the Ninevites or because he thinks the mission is too dangerous. Later in the book, we discover the real reason he doesn't want to go. He knows that if he preaches to Nineveh, the people might actually repent, and if they repent, God will show them mercy. Jonah doesn't want God to forgive his enemies. He wants God to destroy them. So he runs away, not out of fear, but out of hatred and prejudice. God isn't going to let Jonah escape that easily. While Jonah is on the ship, God sends a violent storm that threatens to break the ship apart. The sailors are terrified, and they start throwing cargo overboard to lighten the load. Meanwhile, Jonah has gone below deck and fallen into a deep sleep. The captain wakes him up and tells him to pray to his God for help. The sailors cast lots to find out who is responsible for this disaster, and the lot falls on Jonah. They ask him who he is and where he's from and what he's done to bring this trouble on them. Jonah tells them, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then he admits that he's running away from God. The sailors are horrified because Jonah has told them he's running from the God who controls the sea, and they're in the middle of the sea during a massive storm. They ask Jonah what they should do to make the storm stop. Jonah tells them, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you." At first, the sailors refuse. They try to row back to land, but the storm is too powerful. Finally, they have no choice. They pray to God, asking him not to hold them accountable for killing an innocent man, and then they throw Jonah overboard. Immediately, the storm stops. The sea becomes completely calm. The sailors are so amazed by this that they offer a sacrifice to the Lord and make vows to serve him. Now comes the famous part. Jonah chapter 1 verse 17 says, "Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights." Notice that the text says, God provided this fish. This wasn't a random accident or a natural occurrence. God specifically prepared and sent this fish to rescue Jonah from drowning. Most English translations say great fish or huge fish, but they don't specify what kind of fish it was. The popular image of a whale comes from later traditions, but the Hebrew text just says big fish. Whether it was a whale or a shark or some other large sea creature or even a fish that God created specifically for this purpose, the text doesn't say. What matters is that God was in control of this fish and used it to save Jonah's life. Imagine what those 3 days must have been like for Jonah. He's in complete darkness inside the belly of this creature, surrounded by seawater and stomach acid and whatever the fish had eaten before swallowing him. He can't stand up or move around freely. He's probably getting tossed around every time the fish moves. The smell must have been absolutely terrible. He's facing certain death because no human can survive this situation naturally. But Jonah does survive, and while he's inside the fish, he does something he should have done from the beginning. He prays. Jonah chapter 2 records his prayer, and it's one of the most beautiful prayers in the Bible. He says, "In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead I called for help, and you listened to my cry." Jonah's prayer shows that he recognizes this is God's doing. He says, "You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me." He acknowledges that even though the sailors physically threw him overboard, it was ultimately God who brought him to this place. He takes responsibility for his rebellion, and he expresses faith that God will rescue him. The prayer ends with Jonah saying, "But I with shouts of thanksgiving will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord." This is Jonah committing to obey God and complete his mission. He's learned his lesson about running from God. And immediately after this prayer, verse 10 says, And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Now let's talk about whether this story could actually happen. From a purely natural perspective, the answer is obviously no. Humans cannot survive for 3 days inside a fish. You would suffocate from lack of oxygen. You would be digested by stomach acid. You would die from the trauma and the conditions. There's no known species of fish or whale that could swallow a human whole and keep them alive for 3 days. But here's the thing. The story never presents this as a natural event. From the beginning, it's clearly described as a miracle. God sent the storm. God prepared the fish. God commanded the fish to swallow Jonah. God kept Jonah alive inside the fish. God commanded the fish to vomit Jonah out. Every single part of this story involves direct divine intervention. The question isn't whether it could happen naturally, but whether God could do this supernaturally. If you believe in a God who created the universe and controls the forces of nature, then a God who can keep a man alive inside a fish for 3 days isn't hard to accept. The same God who created life in the first place can certainly preserve life in impossible circumstances. The same God who parts seas and raises the dead can definitely sustain a prophet inside a fish. Some people try to find natural explanations. They point to stories of sailors being swallowed by whales and surviving, or they suggest Jonah might have been in some kind of suspended animation. But these explanations miss the point. The Bible presents this as a miracle, and trying to explain it naturally actually weakens the story's power. The impossibility of the situation is precisely the point, because it demonstrates God's absolute power and control over creation. Understanding why God did this miracle is more important than figuring out how he did it. God could have killed Jonah for his disobedience. He could have let him drown in the sea. He could have found another prophet to send to Nineveh. But instead, God went to extraordinary lengths to save Jonah's life and give him a second chance. The fish wasn't punishment, but it was rescue. It was God's mercy in action. The 3 days inside the fish served several purposes. First, it gave Jonah time to reflect on his rebellion and repent. He was completely helpless and totally dependent on God for his survival. There was nothing he could do to save himself. This forced humility and dependence was exactly what Jonah needed to turn back to God. Second, the experience prepared Jonah for his mission. After going through this ordeal, Jonah would have a powerful testimony about God's mercy and second chances. When he preached to Nineveh about God's judgment, he could also speak about God's willingness to forgive those who repent. Jonah himself had experienced that forgiveness in the most dramatic way possible. Third, the fish incident foreshadowed something much more important. Jesus himself referred to this story in Matthew chapter 12, verses 39 and 40. When the Pharisees asked for a sign, Jesus said, "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but none will be given it, except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Jesus was comparing Jonah's 3 days in the fish to his own 3 days in the tomb before the resurrection. Just as Jonah was delivered from death and given a mission, so Jesus would be raised from death and send his followers on a mission to the whole world. The story of Jonah points forward to the greater story of Jesus and the ultimate rescue from death through his resurrection. The story of Jonah and the fish is ultimately a story about the character of God, who is gracious and compassionate and slow to anger and abounding in love. It's a story about second chances and divine pursuit and the scope of God's mercy that extends to all nations and all people. And it's a story that points forward to Jesus, who, like Jonah, spent 3 days in darkness and then emerged to bring a message of salvation, not just to one city, but to the entire world.